Good morning and welcome to a very special edition of the weekly Texas Public Policy Foundation live stream. I'm Kevin Roberts, your host, and as you can tell, joined by a great American patriot, now distinguished senior fellow of the Hudson Institute, and of course, the 70th Secretary of State of the United States of America, Mike Pompeo. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Kevin, it's great to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
Well, as you and I were just chatting before we came online, you've got a schedule here in Texas talking about the great things that the Trump administration did. What you and I are going to talk about today are some troubling things, frankly. Our audience knows, and most of them tuning in from outside Texas, that we will cover every major policy issue facing us with smiles on our faces. But that means, and I think you personified this in your career, that we diagnose those problems very candidly so that we can come up with solutions. So I just want to ask you a couple of 30,000-foot questions, if you don't mind. Here you are a few months after serving as Secretary of State. You're observing the world. You're observing the new administration. What's your assessment of America's strategic position in the world right now?
So it's an important question. And without getting into the dynamics of the two administrations, I must say, I traveled to some 80 countries in 2.5 years more before that when I was a CIA director. Mm-hmm. People are dying for leadership from the United States of America. They want us to be there. They know that we are the bulwark of security for every country in the world. We are the bulwark of economic security. We're the bulwark of diplomatic capacity and power. And of course, we have an unrivaled military capability as well. So wherever I went, wherever I landed, they wanted to see me. They didn't want to see Mike. They wanted to see the Secretary of State for the United States of America who could help them. We shouldn't squander that. Mm-hmm. And that means two things. One, we can't disengage, but we have to be very restrained in how we think about using this power. It is not infinite. It is not free. It has an enormous cost to the United States when we use it. But if we do it right, if we think about it the way the president and I did, which was we put America first, we're unabashed about saying that, I swore an oath to defend the United States of America. And that is our first priority. If we're unabashed about that, I think countries will respect it and they will come alongside of us and want to be our partners, friends, allies, economic trading partners. They know that the way we think about the world is the right way. And I hope this next administration will continue that and not sacrifice American values on the cross of climate change or radical woke leftism or whatever it may be that is the mantra from the left part of their party.
Well, we have a vested interest, in spite of whatever our philosophical differences may be with the new administration, for them to succeed, especially in foreign policy. And I think one of the things that the Trump administration and you did very well was being remarkably consistent in foreign policy. And I think that y'all had some folks who might have been skeptics early on in the Trump administration who came around to your way of thinking. And that happens when you're leading. It happens when you're consistent. One follow-up question I have before we move on to a couple of the specific issues of China and Mexico is, as you were traveling the world as Secretary of State, did you ever get significant pushback in private from world leaders about the America First policy?
Almost none.
Yeah.
When I got it, it was from our adversaries, not those.
Good, that's a good sign, right?
Not those who wanted to be friends of America. The pushback against America, which people understood it intrinsically. People understood it. And we were very candid too. We said, when I met with Chancellor Merkel or whoever it was, you should be Germany first.
Amen.
Right? You should, when I meet with the president of the Dominican Republic, you should care about the DR first. And we admire that and we respect that. And it is your job. And so it was that central understanding that we took and we're just very candid about. But when you do that, when you're open about who you are and what it is you're trying to accomplish, you can really get to the heart of the challenges that are represented around the world.
Well, I think that's hopefully some inspiration for folks who are now in the shoes you used to fill there. We have some concern here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation about two of the dynamics you mentioned. They using climate change as sort of the context in which we do foreign policy, and also the leftist wokeness. And I'm grateful for you and your continuing leadership outside office now to be pushing on that. So let's pivot, if you don't mind, Mr. Secretary, to a couple of specific issues. Those of us who follow the news closely, especially those of us in Texas, are concerned about two foreign policy issues. One, not just close to Texas, but adjacent to us, and that's Mexico. We'll turn to that second. I really want, especially for our audience outside Texas, to hear your thoughts about what's going on with China right now. It's obviously a very high-profile meeting in the last few days in Alaska. I'll ask you about that from this layman's point of view. It didn't look like it went well for the United States, but would love your assessment about that. But before we get into the specifics, what's China doing? I think most of our audience, as they were sending in some questions early, believe that China has lapped us. that the United States is now in second place, so to speak. How would you respond to that?
So I don't believe for a moment that we're in second place, but there's a real risk of that.
Okay.
And let me walk through how I think we got to where we are and our theory of the case on how we make sure that the next generation is dominated by a Western set of thought, a set of a rules-based order that we know and that our founders wanted us to have here in the United States of America. For 4 decades, Republicans and Democrats alike thought that engagement with China would be a solution, that we'd see them change their ways, not necessarily even their internal dynamic. We have a lot of tolerance for countries that have different systems inside of the country, but we thought that they'd become less hostile, that they would engage in the world and trade on a set of rules that we understood. And when they made promises internationally, whether that was about the South China Sea or Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet, that they'd live up to them. And all we needed to do was trade just a little bit more with them. That proved an enormous failure, proved a central misunderstanding of the world and, most importantly, of the Chinese Communist Party and its leader today, Xi Jinping. President Trump and I stared at this and said, "That's just nuts." I'm trying to simplify this for this morning. That doesn't make any sense. It has failed. We have to go a different direction. We have to protect American workers. And so we started with trade. The president talked about this during his campaign. We said, no, we're going to trade on a fair and reciprocal basis with every country, and that must therefore include China. When it came to military issues, we're going to make sure we have the strongest military capable of defending the United States and the things that matter to economic commerce around the world. We're going to do that in a way that is restrained and appropriate. And we're going to very clearly lay out for the Chinese Communist Party that you can't come to dominate a region in a way that will deny Western ideology. So whether it was the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization or at the United Nations, wherever it was we found China, or in Africa with the Belt and Road Initiative, I could go on. We pushed back in a real way. It was a blessing to have a president that was prepared to lead and take the risk that was associated with that. But we were serious about it. There wasn't an ambassador that worked for me anywhere in the world that didn't understand that their top priority may have been serving as a relation to the country that they were in. Their second priority was China.
Yes.
Wherever it was they were, whether they were in Southeast Asia or Africa or the Middle East, they knew that China mattered to this president, to this administration, and that we needed to get this right.
Yeah, well, thanks for that analysis. I'm sure our audience appreciated it. A follow-up question to that with a very brief caveat or context. You've struck me because I study leaders. One of the things we do here at the foundation by how careful you've been in offering unsolicited advice to the new administration. That's a custom in this country that all of us, liberals, conservatives, folks in between, really ought to honor. And I'm grateful that you're doing that. The point is, if you were going to offer some advice, and you're going to do that as a friend, as a fellow patriot to President Biden and his administration about what to do with China as a result of some of the remarks they made at this meeting in Alaska last week, what would that advice be?
So I am always careful. They're in the seat. I'm the former.
Sure.
I wish that they had treated us that way.
Yes.
Many of them chose not to do that. So be it. There's no need to retaliate for that. But I do want to offer them ideas about things that we saw that worked and things that we didn't. I've done that privately. But I've talked about publicly the way the United States needs to respond to China. And, you know, the meetings in Anchorage present risk to the United States because the Chinese attacked the fundamental nature of the United States of America.
Right.
So it wasn't about a moment or a particular language or particular words, but they grabbed onto what the Chinese believe most deeply, which is that America is a nation in decline.
Yeah.
And that thesis, one that they propagate through misinformation around the world and through different propaganda tools, the theory of American decline is something I hope that Americans don't come to believe. It's fundamentally untrue. And we have to work at it. We have to make sure that it never becomes true, but it's fundamentally untrue. And the Chinese want the world to believe that, because if we're in decline, then other countries will want to be their friends. They'll be fearful that the United States won't be there to be their important partner. And so I would urge this administration, when your Chinese counterpart says that Black Lives Matter is a central part of your administration, when a Marxist-Leninist ideology is a center point of your administration, you have to push back on that. You have to, if you don't, they may well be true. And I regret that. They talked about the fact that they use these terms that were incredibly morally relativistic. The central idea that somehow America doesn't have a set of human rights understandings that are important and fundamentally different than the way the Chinese treat their own citizens. It's just wrong. So they grab news from headlines from the news. So they grab things that CNN says, they grab things that are in the New York Times, and they say, see, this is who America really is. Well, it's not true. And we can't let them get away with propagating that all around the world, because it will diminish us in the eyes of our allies and friends, and create enormous problems building the coalition we all need to push back against these Marxist socialist ideas that the Chinese Communist parties want to come dominate the next generation.
Sure. And I would observe as a historian for maybe our younger audience members, there was a time when folks on the American left and on the American right largely agreed when it came to America first and American power, especially as it pertained to our communist enemies. And it would maybe, you've got some optimism that you're advocating today, which I love, what we love here at TBPF. Maybe we can get back to that as a result of the new administration taking this advice from you, especially in the spirit in which it's intended. So let's talk about another thorny issue, and then we'll get to some audience questions if you don't mind. We're here in Texas, of course, we're concerned deeply about China because of the significance of the Texas economic miracle, if you will, but we're very concerned on every level about what's going on at our southern border. You know Texas well, Mr. Secretary. You know that we love immigrants, we love immigration. Texas and America are the two greatest, most successful experiments in civil society in the history of the world because we understand diversity properly understood. And the point is that I would submit to you the new administration's and its policy is really beginning to interfere with that. So high level again, before we get into some of the detail, what do you think the answer is to the current border crisis?
So I think we had it. I think we grasped this nearly perfectly. And while we executed in a bumpy way, we ultimately got there. We had courts challenging some of the work that we did, but in the end, we got the policy right. What is that? It's the central understanding of American sovereignty and the central understanding of America and its founding principles about when people want to come to the United States, we want to encourage that. We want them to do so in a way that is consistent with our understanding of rules and the law. I'll never forget a great story. I was a member of Congress a long time ago now, and would have people call in from Europe and say, hey, how do I get to America? And, you wanted to say to them, sure, boy, I know it's frustrating. You're in the 9th year waiting on the list. We can't allow that to happen. That is deeply inconsistent with who we are. And so we took the idea of American sovereignty and the fact that we wanted to know what was coming across our border, who was coming out across our border for all the reasons, terrorism, narcotics, all the things that we know. And then we implemented it. I spent a lot of time with Marcelo Ebrard, my foreign minister counterpart down in Mexico, former mayor of Mexico City, working out a system that worked for the United States, for Mexico, and for El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala as well. An intricate set of rules that said, if you want to apply for asylum, there's a set of rules, comply with them. But while you're waiting, you're going to remain in Mexico. Yeah. We call it the MPP, but it's become known as remain in Mexico. And it was just this understanding that that's the appropriate way for international law to recognize asylum claims. And it worked. It turned the magnet off for the United States and avoided what you see today, which is I watch these pictures. I haven't had a chance to get down there, but you watch these pictures. It's a national security crisis on our southern border. It is a deep humanitarian crisis. I talked to lots of people who had tried to make that journey and were unsuccessful, and the horrors that they experienced from the coyotes and the cartels that were trafficking them across the border. This isn't in America's best interest. It's not in Mexico's best interest, and it's certainly not in the best interest of these people who are in difficult situations in Central America who simply want a better life.
It's true, and I think often here at the foundation, I know y'all did a great job of this in the administration. Part of the policy solution is making sure we're framing the debate in the proper way that's based on facts. And as we mention often to legislators, members of our Texas delegation to Congress, we have to understand that we have to frame this issue in a way that really puts those people who want to migrate here in focus, right? And for all of the reasons you mentioned, this is not a good situation for those folks. We want people who want to come to the United States be able to do so legally and quickly and transparently. And unfortunately, what the administration is doing right now is really complicating that. Follow-up question, maybe going back to your days as a member of Congress representing your Kansas district, what advice would you give Congress? What advice would you give the U.S. House and U.S. Senate about what they need to do in order to address this crisis?
I think they got to go fix this. And they need to convince their Republicans in Congress need to convince their Democrat colleagues precisely what you described. It gets pitched as an emotional issue.
That's right.
And it is that. It's a deeply emotional issue for those who are stuck in this terrible situation. The solution cannot simply be to have them come across, make this trek, take that risk, and then be housed in terrible situations here on our side of the border. That is inevitable if you get this policy wrong. And that's the argument that needs to be made. And they need to urge this administration to get serious about this. President Biden has said, we don't want them to come, but every action that they've taken, every action has suggested that if you come and if you get here, you will find a way to find work and find opportunity and be able to stay here forever. When that's the case, they're not going to listen to American messaging. They're going to listen to the text message or the WhatsApp or the email or the phone call they have with their cousin or their family member or their friend who's here and says, come, take the risk. It's worth the try. You can't permit that to be the message that's received, because if you do, you will do enormous harm to them.
Yeah, it is a humanitarian crisis. So we'll switch gears here. One more question about the rest of the world, and then we'll get to audience questions. So if you're in the audience and you haven't submitted your question yet, just go to the comments section of the social media channel you're using, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Last question for me for now, Mr. Secretary, is we've talked about China, we've talked about Mexico. Any other parts of the world that, based on your experience and knowledge, you're paying close attention to that maybe our audience members are not, given the amount of media attention on China and Mexico?
You know, we shouldn't forget the challenge that's presented from nuclear proliferation. So whether that's North Korea and the problem that we confronted at the front end of our time in 4 years, or the nuclear efforts that the Iranians are engaged in, the terror efforts that they're engaged in around the world. This is the most anti-Semitic country in the world, and this administration has already released at least $1 billion. Looks like it may be $4 billion. That money's not going to go to good purposes. And their capacity to extort the world, if those countries get advance their nuclear programs in a way that presents a significant proliferation risk, is real and will reduce our liberty here at home. Yeah, well, I figured it would be a response that would cause us a little bit of concern, but that's the nature of the work, right? Yes, sir. Well, look, as you will soon find out, I don't ask the good questions. Our audience does. And so those of you in the audience, you're already sending in some questions. We'll get into as many of them as we can. We'll take the first one here, Mr. Secretary. Will President Biden make military or economic concessions to China in order to get them on board with climate change initiatives? This is that's a great question. This is the one issue that I've spoken about publicly, trying to assist the next administration in confronting what we saw. I'm afraid that that's the path that they're headed down. People are often policy. That is, people come into an administration with their own set of ideas, and that impacts where you land. If you look at the team that President Biden has brought on board, whether that is having a former Secretary of State as a cabinet member, very unusual. Working to be the so-called climate leader, climate czar, call him what you will. Czar, I think is appropriate. Yes. You have Susan Rice in the White House. You have Wendy Sherman back. You have a group of people. You have Gina McCarthy, who was the head of EPA during my time in Congress. This is a group of people who see the world through this vision of climate change as a political and almost article of religious faith. And when you do that, when you put that at the top of your priority list, when you don't say, nope, America first is our priority, but rather climate change is our priority, there's very little you won't trade to get to that thing that's at the top of your list. Yeah. Thank you for that response, and thank you, audience, for sending that in. Second question is maybe related in ways that some folks don't realize. It's a question about the Keystone XL pipeline. In what ways has the cancellation of that pipeline influenced our standing on the global scene? I think the world looks at that and says, what on earth are you doing? This is a pipeline. It's been around for years and years and years, even from 6, 8, 10 years ago. That makes perfect sense. That it's had more environmental reviews than you can shake a stick at, and that would be enormously enabling for the United States. I tell people this, and it surprises them sometimes. There were very few meetings that I went into around the world where energy wasn't at the top of the list for my counterpart, whether it was in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, whether it was in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam or Singapore or Malaysia. Wherever I went, people depend on being able to turn the lights on and to drive their vehicles and to create manufactured goods that use petrochemicals at the core source for their plastics or whatever it may be. They were excited that the United States had turned on this capacity to transport petroleum and natural gas around the world, and they wanted to build a port to receive it or a terminal to cool it and freeze it and transport it, or they wanted us to help them build pipelines so that they could control that. It's an economic matter, but it's also an enormous national security matter. And so for the United States to now back away from that and say, no, we're going to turn inward, we're not going to promote American energy both here and abroad, is something that I think weakens us across the world. And the world certainly took notice. Well, and our American media, just as a brief addendum, don't do us any favors, right? Because 95% of the coverage is about the couple of protests in South Dakota or wherever, and not anything about the analysis you just offered. So if that frustrates you, just keep tuning in and following Secretary Pompeo.
Next question, sir. The Biden press secretary said this week, quote, "Our administration is going to take a different approach to Russia than the prior administration. The Russians will be accountable for the actions they have taken," end quote. What's your reaction to that statement?
Just remember back to a great leader, Mr. Roosevelt, who said, talk softly and carry a big stick. If you're going to talk loudly, you better be prepared to defend and support the rhetoric that you use. We often, although not always, tried the different approach, which was to be constructive and realistic and restrained. I think that's what our founders wanted. If you go back and read the Federalist Papers and talk about how America should engage in the world, they talked about a restrained United States of America, not a disengaged one, but a restrained one, a realistic one. When I hear that rhetoric, I understand it. Vladimir Putin's a bad guy. Vladimir Putin does not intend well for democracy in the West. So those are points that are well taken. But we got it right. We put more sanctions on Russia than any administration in history. We defended the Ukrainian people by providing them weapon systems so they could defend themselves in the southeast part. You'll recall that Crimea was taken from the Ukrainians on the previous administration's watch, and there was no or nearly no costs imposed on them for that. When I hear this rhetoric, I worry only that this rhetoric will be undermined by actions. And as soon as that happens, as soon as you make a statement or a claim or draw a red line, as President Obama did in Syria, and don't back it up with real actions and real deeds, the world will see you as a paper tiger and they will drive a truck through that.
So let me ask you a follow-up question from what I like to call the sidewalk level. This just occurred to me. I'm sure the audience member won't mind. One of the things we try to do in our daily work is identify policy problems, identify solutions, but then give our friends out there, who are tuning in, our grassroots friends, some next steps, some action items. What I hear, as I'm sure you have heard thousands of times, is that thoughtful Americans who see what China is doing, the news this morning about North Korea testing nuclear missiles again, they see the Mexico situation, the Russia situation, they feel as if, the average American feels as if they have no power, no influence over getting the administration or Congress to take action. What kind of advice, maybe even a little bit of encouragement, would you give Americans who have the best of intentions? They're probably even praying for President Biden every day, even though they didn't vote for him because they're patriots, but they're disaffected. And so based on your leadership, your experience, what advice would you give them on not losing hope and maybe participating in a solution?
So I think back to the time that was 10 years ago when I was running a small company back in Kansas. I felt very much the same way. What did Susan and I do? Well, we started with prayer each day for whoever our leaders were, the city council, the school board, whoever it may have been. Second, we tried to learn as much as we could so that we'd have a fact base. And we tried to think about how it made a difference to me. I ran a machine shop. We made airplane parts and then ultimately a company that made oil and gas equipment. Sold a lot of it. It had a big operation in Midland, Texas.
That means you're a great American.
It was a joyous time. I loved coming to the Permian Basin Oil Show. It was a lot of fun. But think about how it impacted the people that were around us, the people at our church, the people in the business that I was responsible for, our friends in the neighborhood. And then we did our best to make sure and communicate that to people around us, talk about it at PTA meetings, wherever we were, to make sure folks understood. One of the things I hope to do in my time after being the Secretary of State and the CI Director is to try and translate some of this complexity, the things people see around the world, in a way that folks who have real jobs and are really working and are out there in the real world can understand and see. When I think of China, it impacts the jobs for people in Wichita, Kansas immensely if we get China wrong, if we don't get this policy right. It's not about some meeting in Anchorage or some diplomatic engagement in Brussels. It's about the reality of the life for human beings here in the United States of America. And so I'd ask everyone, don't disengage. It matters. Elections matter, policy matters. These things really have a real effect. It's funny, I'm not sure if you know this, Kevin. I was very involved in Kansas's version of the Texas Public Policy Institute. It was called the Flint Hills Resources Institute at the time. Now it's called the Kansas Public Policy Institute. But I was one of the member trustees on the board. These policy organizations do the Lord's work in helping people understand what's going on in the world in a way that you're almost certainly not going to get if you flip on the TV, because the world's a little more complicated than you can do in a 2-minute soundbite.
That is true. Well, thanks for the plug for a great sister group in Kansas and indirectly for us. So we'll get back to a couple of audience questions. And then before we wrap, the Secretary Pompeo, I have a couple of questions I always ask our guests, so I'm going to pitch them to you. There are questions about optimism, so I think you're going to be just fine. But from the audience member here, how can we use inalienable rights per the Secretary's Commission report to counter China's influence?
Thanks for the reference to this work that I led at the State Department. It was really important. The State Department has a huge group that works on human rights around the world. And what I found was we couldn't speak about it in a way that was serious and thoughtful and consistent with what I understood human rights to be around the world. So I thought about it for a little bit. I brought in some people a lot smarter than me, and we ultimately created this commission that you referenced. There's a report. I'd love you to go read it. It's 56 pages long. It's an easy read. You can even just read the front 3 pages, and it talks about human beings that were created in the image of God and the rights that we have as a result of that. And the things that sometimes get referred to as rights that simply can't be human rights. And it's really important. And so what this commission attempted to do, and I think they did a wonderful job, was to reground America's understanding of human rights in the tradition from America's founders. That was my job as Secretary of State. So they went back and looked at how America has always viewed human beings as the most important actor in the political stage, not groups, not dividing by particular sex or regions or race, but rather the human being and the family. And so you can see it, and you'll see the report. It's really important as it comes to China, because the Chinese Communist Party has a fundamentally different understanding of human rights. You saw it in the comments they made at Anchorage. You can see it in the comments they made when I met with them. They view human rights through the lens of Marxism, Leninism. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Sounds scary.
Yes. If you read just a little bit of it, you'll want to close the book quickly. Socialism with Chinese characteristics isn't about people. It's about power and influence and corruption and the capacity for the Communist Party to continue to dominate not only all of the regions of China, which if you're a historian of China, you realize has not been a continuous place for an awfully long time in history. And second, to spread that idea and that ideology around the world. We can't allow it to happen. And I hope that the commission's work to refocus the State Department, how we think about human rights as we travel around the world, will help us push back against the threat that the Chinese communist ideology presents to all of us.
Well, an excellent question, and thanks for the response. What we'll do, I assume that report is archived on the Secretary of State's website, but we'll be sure and put it on our site for audience members who might want to come to our site, texaspolicy.com instead. So we've got another audience question about China. I want to just take a quick break from that and ask you a question that someone emailed me this morning, one of our friends here at the foundation. And they said, Kevin, amid all of the understandable focus on China and Mexico and North Korea and Russia, I've not seen a lot about America's involvement with the European Union, especially in light of the United Kingdom voting to leave it for all intents and purposes. And this audience member was curious about your thoughts about that, the future of the EU, the future of UK-American relations, not just under this current administration, but maybe 10 or 20 years down the road.
We need the European experiment to be successful.
We do. We always have, right?
We always have. Just as I'm confident the American experiment will continue to be successful, we need the European experiment to be successful. They are struggling. They're struggling because they have put such a status layer on top of not only this international mechanism of the European Union, but also inside their own governments. In most countries in Europe, there's a more dynamic part of Europe than we think of. From France and Germany are less so, but some of these Eastern European countries are very dynamic, and I expect good things will come from them. The economies are smaller. But if you step up one level more, we need them to join this battle of ideas, this central understanding of the West as an important bulwark against tyranny. If we can get them to do that, if we can get them to accept that and their responsibility in that, which President Trump tried to do, NATO was the proxy, but the idea was more than just, hey, you got to spend more money to defend yourself. It was bigger than that. It was, we need you to stand up for this set of ideas, these ideas about democracy and freedom and liberty and pushing back against tyranny. And we need you to join us in that fight and be serious about it and preach this to your people. Last thought, I gave a speech in Brussels early on at my time as Secretary of State. So I've been the CI director. I'd been over there a few times, and I had a feel for the lay of the land. I went up and gave a speech, and I've never walked out of such a quiet room in my life. Not a golf clap around. But what I had done was lay down what our understanding of what the relationship between the United States and Europe needed to look like, not today and tomorrow, but for the next 50 years. 2 years later, I went and gave a speech that wasn't terribly different than that in Munich, this time at the security conference. Very different reception. They had come to appreciate that we were serious about being a force for good and to work alongside them. And I was very happy that in those 2 years, we'd been able to convince them that our understanding of the threat from China, our understanding of the threats from Russia, and more importantly, our understanding of the threats that come from authoritarian regimes all around the world was serious. And we were prepared to use American power to try and shape those things.
Well, what I love about that, in addition to the obvious achievement, is that national defense doesn't just involve very important material of war, right? It involves the brain and being willing to have political courage, especially in Eastern Europe right now, where there's so much reason for hope. And just thinking historically, and going back 1,500 years ago, it was Central and Eastern Europe that really was or were the bulwark of our Western mode of thought. So the continuity there across history is really important. And I think, well, not that you're looking for this, because you and your former boss, President Trump, are not looking for credit, but the history will judge this administration very fondly when it comes to not just American interests, but the interests of how we understand human persons to be free in the image and likeness of God. So thank you. One more question about China, and then we'll move toward the final questions. This audience member, Secretary Pompeo, asks, how serious of a threat do you see China's presence in our southern hemisphere?
So China is active in nearly every nation around the world. That certainly includes Mexico, Central America, but also South America too. Largely financial, although not exclusively. A lot of technical assistance, military technical assistance being provided to the Maduro regime by the Chinese. As Argentina has struggled financially, the Chinese have shown up with some non-market possibilities for a financial path forward for them that will have an enormous political price throughout South America if the Chinese are successful. I hope the United States will provide an alternative solution. I think that'll end up being the case. But make no mistake, China would very much love to get a foothold in South America. They know it's close. They know it's an important set of trading partners for the United States, and they are very active in that region. This is not something that's good for the United States.
Right in our own backyard. Again, going back to history, think about the Monroe Doctrine, right? The first statement of America being a little more proactive on the geopolitical stage 200 years ago. So getting into the final questions, and I just want to thank the audience members for, as always, submitting excellent questions. One of the two questions I have for you, Secretary Pompeo, is, as a conservative leading the largest policy group outside DC, we think a lot, not just about specific policies, not just about the foreign policy that you've discussed with us this morning, but about the future of conservatism. And this is important to every American, even liberals. The future of liberalism is important to you and me, right? But for us as conservatives, we're a little more focused on the future of conservatism. And I don't mean that in the sense of election cycles. And I'm not going to ask you that question, although I'm tempted. It's about the future of ideas, the future of how we talk about conservatism in America. The Trump administration has had many achievements. One of them is reframing the narrative about what it means to be a conservative. Given your experience as Secretary of State, member of Congress, business owner, someone who knows this country well, not to mention Army veteran, what do you think the future of conservatism is? What are the policies and issues that we're going to talk about, and how should we be talking about them?
I always harken back to my heroes who wrote our founding documents. They talked about America and its Judeo-Christian traditions with freedom and liberty for the individual at the center, and this idea, kind of a Catholic idea of subsidiarity to follow, right? If you read the Federalist Papers, they talked about these little platoons. They talked about schools and family and communities. I think conservatism is at its best when we acknowledge that the best things that happen almost always happen in small places, in the quiet places of America, where real people engage with their friends and their family members and the other people in their community to make life better for individuals. Frankly, one of the things about the Republican Party that we have not gotten right is we've spent too much money too. And it's not, so there's a fiscal component to this, but it is also a liberty component. There's this component that says if we take everything to Washington, centralize it, this is not in the conservative tradition. And it will minimize the capacity for individuals to have liberty and freedom in the way that the good people here in the Republic understand it.
Indeed. Well said. Thanks for that response. So we didn't cue any of that, but this is music.
No, that was an
Here's-
unexpected question. Yes, so all off the top.
Well, thanks for taking the curveball and hitting it out of the park. Last question, one that hopefully is a softball. I would intend it as such for someone I disagree with, because I think all of us, whether we're liberals or conservatives, should wake up in this country proud to be an American. And that is, over the last 15 months, this country has endured so much. The real health threat for many Americans from COVID, the real threat we've all felt from government shutdowns, economic side of that as well, an election that was contentious to say the least. And that has caused many Americans on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the political spectrum, not to believe optimistically about the future of this country. Why did you wake up this morning optimistic about America today, but also America in the future?
Yeah, it has been a long 13, 14 months. I was in the center of the maelstrom for some of it. Some of it I was a little bit off to the side on the domestic health issues, weren't in the center of what I was doing. But I saw it, and I had a chance to see how it was impacting people around the world and people back here at home as well. I'm optimistic because when I watch how America responds to these things, whether it was the COVID-19 virus itself, whether it was the economic challenges that confronted us, or whether it was the events that happened in the election and through January 6th, I watched how America responded to that. I watched our Constitution hold. I watched people rally around the central understanding of, no, we're not going to let this take America in a direction we don't want it to go, and grab hold of that in a serious way. I've seen this in the, 8, 9, 10 weeks that I've been out of office. I've had so many really kind notes from people around the world that says, bolstering me, trying to convince me that what we did was right and noble and important and would be foundational for America moving forward. I fundamentally believe that the American experience is unchallengeable, but faith without work is not of much value. It's going to take all of us who believe in these conservative ideas to continue to educate ourselves, to be grounded, and to work each and every day to make sure we are advancing these ideas that I and my family hold so dear.
So now's the time, even though some folks in the left of center media want us to go put our nose in the corner, to actually stand on the rooftops and proclaim the good news.
Absolutely, yes. Stand athwart history.
Amen. Well, Secretary Mike Pompeo, can't thank you enough for making time for this today. I know our audience members enjoyed this, most of all on behalf of all of them, certainly on behalf of all of us here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you, and God bless you for being a great patriot, for your service. I hope you feel that gratitude in the fiber of your being, because you and your colleagues in the Trump administration did stand athwart history and told the truth and pointed to true north, and we're all very grateful for it. So God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you
bet.
all. Thank you
Thanks
all.
for being with us.
Thank you all for joining me this morning.
Y'all have a great day. We'll see you next Monday with an equally interesting panel, although not with Secretary Mike Pompeo. Y'all have a wonderful week. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of your hands. Take care.
Thank you all.